Welcome to the NU Digital Classroom article review. CHSF Psych 4306. Hope you're having a good day. Grab a coffee, comfy chair, maybe some headphones, go for a walk, and we're going to get into some interesting ideas. Cheers. Okay, so today I want to be looking at this article called Cave Syndrome. This is from Scientific American. I'll switch views here just for 1 sec so you can see. This is coming from Scientific American, May 3rd, 2021. Right, so I'm recording this class like a few weeks before you're going to see some of this content. So this is basically, today's the 4th, so this was yesterday's news. All right, let me change angles here. My bald head's pretty big here. Let's switch like this. Everyone's a little more comfortable now. Okay. And then I'm going to switch back to the more reader-friendly one. If anyone uses Chrome, it's called Just Read. It's a great extension. So Cave Syndrome by Melba Newsom, May 3rd, 2021. Cave syndrome keeps the vaccinated in social isolation. So she's using this term, and this is coming from Scientific American, a very solid source. After being diagnosed with COVID in November 2020, Andrea King Coiler doubted that the antibodies she developed in response to the illness would protect her from a second infection and was determined to be first in or near the front in the line for vaccines. I should pause and just say my idea with these is like you can either listen to them and do some work around your house or whatever, have them in your headphones, or you can, like, if you want to read along with me, that's cool too. Trying to make these digestible. The Flint, Michigan resident registered at every vaccine distribution site she could find and never stopped looking for a way to receive shots early. By February 21st, Coiler had received her second dose of the Pfizer vaccine. But when the Center for Disease Control and Prevention gave the green light for vaccinated people to resume pre-pandemic activities, such as gathering indoors without masks on March 8th, she did not experience the sense of freedom she had imagined. If anything, she became more fearful of infection. She's yet to eat in a restaurant or see anyone beyond her pandemic bubble. Formerly an avid traveler, Coiler says she can't imagine getting on an airplane again or in the foreseeable future. To keep remembering to scroll on this other side. After a year in isolation, many people who have developed an intimate understanding of what it means to be socially isolated are afraid to return to their former lives despite being fully vaccinated. There's even a name for this experience, the clinical sounding cave syndrome. Right, that you've almost become psychologically attached to, well, it's like it's not really beating around the bush. It's really saying this idea of like almost like a cave psychology, underground, or it's like the opposite of a social public. And that people are struggling with the idea of how to re-engage. It makes complete sense. People have had like a year and a half pause in their social training. Emerging into the light after a year locked inside is proving to be a difficult transition for some people. Jacqueline Golan, a professor of psychiatry and behavioral science at Northwestern University, says that adjusting to the new normal, whatever it may be, is going to take time. The pandemic-related changes created a lot of fear and anxiety because of the risk of illness and death, along with the repercussions in many areas of life, she says. Even though a person may be vaccinated, they still may find it difficult to go out and let go of the fear because they're potentially overestimating, or she didn't say potentially, because they're overestimating the risk and probability. They're doing their statistics incorrectly. A recent study by the American Psychological Association reported that 49% of surveyed adults anticipated being uncomfortable about returning to in-person interactions after the pandemic ends. Think of that. That's half of people. That's almost literally half of people are worried about this. It's like, I'm worried about it for the kids, worried about it for people at every age. Found that 48% of those who have received a COVID vaccine said they felt the same way. Right? So that's interesting. So it's like the first one seemed, I just paused because I was trying to see the difference. I guess the first 49 is in general, and then 48 is of vaccine people, which is interesting because that's like statistically identical, or obviously not identical, but close. These long-term psychological effects were not unforeseen. In May 2020, researchers at University of British Columbia published a study in the Journal of Anxiety that predicted that Journal of Anxiety, I should look into that, that predicted that an estimated 10% of people in the midst of this pandemic will develop COVID stress syndrome. Okay, I wanted to put that word up. After coping with severe psychological problems such as post-traumatic stress disorder or mood or anxiety disorders. Alan Theo, an associate professor of psychiatry at Oregon Health and Science University, attributes cave syndrome to 3 factors: habit, risk perception. Okay, so habits, risk perception, and social connection. We had to learn the habit of wearing masks, physical distancing, social distancing, not inviting people over, he says. It's very hard to break a habit once you form it. There's a disconnect between actual amount of risk and what people perceive as the risk. He adds that there's a focus on the risk of affection and death rather than the risk of dying from being lonely or disconnected. Good quote. People are reluctant to resume their pre-COVID lives for different reasons. Some still have extreme fear of the disease, while others do not want to forfeit what they found to be positive benefits they've derived from the forced isolation and solitude. I have this interesting video included here.
It's just like a white desert. For as far as you can see, there is absolutely nothing. And you come back and it's overwhelming.
Between 2016 and 2018, Dr. Tim Heitland spent 14 months in Antarctica as part of a 12-person German research team. When he returned to regular life, things felt different.
The first thing I did was like hug a tree.
Being away from the icy continent felt normal after a few days. But one thing still didn't feel right: being surrounded by people.
There was a feeling that lasted for a long time, really long, easily more than a year.
Throughout Heitland's journey, a team of researchers studied the doctor and his colleagues to pinpoint the effects of long-term isolation. Their most striking finding was that nearly all of the explorers' brains physically changed. Isolation has profound effects on us. Scientists are only beginning to understand the full scope of these changes, and they're doing cutting-edge research to discover if and how we can overcome them. Because although humans didn't evolve to live in isolation, many of us are beginning to spend more and more time alone, and that could be a big problem.
Yep, exactly.
Being in Antarctica is very different from normal life.
You get a lot of hurricane force storms, and in the beginning it frightens you. People, like in our first storm, we've been sitting in the station and sometimes it starts to shake, and then it's a place of total absolute silence.
Wow.
Living in such a stark environment profoundly alters the brain.
Yep.
Over the course of 14 months, most of Heitland's crew lost volume in part of the hippocampus, a region involved in spatial navigation, learning, and emotional processing.
This is especially for us interesting because this has something to do with your memory. We do not know for the moment what is lost there.
Dr. Hans Christian Gunga was one of the researchers leading the study. Although his team's data doesn't show exactly what faculties the expeditioners lost, they found changes similar to what you'd expect to see in patients with depression or Alzheimer's disease.
How interesting is
So
that?
significant that Gunga wondered if they'd made a mistake.
When you compare that to the post-traumatic stress syndrome, they have sometimes not so strong changes as these guys they're down in Antarctica.
These kinds of neurological changes can have major effects on behavior. In 2018, shortly after Heitland returned from his 14-month mission, another Antarctic expeditioner stabbed one of his crewmates, who was annoying him by spoiling the endings to books.
Oh, I remember
Spoiler
that.
alert almost turned deadly.
The problem isn't Antarctica, but isolation.
Yeah.
In February, a group of researchers published an analysis of more than 3,000 studies on the psychological effects of quarantine. They found extremely high rates of PTSD among people who'd previously been quarantined, whether for SARS or equine influenza. Solitary confinement also leads to high prevalence of PTSD and depression. These trauma-related disorders strongly suggest underlying brain damage. And the latest animal research shows the damage extends far beyond the hippocampus.
I became really interested in social isolation because I was kind of drawn to increases in violence that seem to be occurring more in our society.
Dr. Muriel Zelikowski studies the science of fear and aggression.
Really, one of the ways you get this huge increase in violence is having these increases.
I didn't
in
watch the
social isolation.
video.
That's kind
I
of
read the
due
article,
across a
but
variety of species.
While doing her postdoctoral research at Caltech, Zelikowski and her team isolated mice for 2 weeks and then studied changes in their behavior and brain function.
Mhm.
They focused their
Interesting.
study on a specific molecule called TAC2 that triggers
TAC2.
stress response.
The goal was to
Cortisol.
really tie this increase in TAC2 to functional changes in behavior related to social isolation.
When an animal is exposed to stress, TAC2, and potentially a host of additional molecules, signal a stress response across the brain. So when the mice are kept in isolation and the stress persists, the animals start acting skittish and aggressive.
Whoa.
When the team started looking at mouse brains, they expected to find elevated levels of TAC2 in specific parts of the brain, like the amygdala, which handles fear. Instead, they found TAC2 in numerous regions across the brain. When they tagged the molecule with a green fluorescent compound, the effect was so dramatic, you could see it without a microscope.
Unlike a single traumatic event or some memory being stored in a particular part of the brain, what seemed to happen with isolation is many different parts of the brain were affected, some of which weren't even really connected to each other.
Zelikowski and her team believe some of those clusters of elevated TAC2 explain extremely abnormal behaviors that persist after isolation, like irrational fears and violent behavior. They did find proactive ways to make the isolation less damaging and reverse its effects, but it's hard, if not impossible, to re-socialize mice once they've been isolated.
Oh, man.
All of this paints a pretty grim picture of isolation, but some experts argue that's missing a huge part of the story, because many people say confinement experiences change their lives for the better.
There you are.
This is Jack Stuster, an anthropologist who spent decades helping NASA make life in space more livable. In 2003, he began the longest-running experiment on the International Space Station, analyzing confidential journals astronauts kept while in space. Stuster says the journals provide unique insight into the minds of astronauts and the many changes they experience while in orbit.
In some cases, I learned more than I really wanted to know. I mean, someone going through marriage problems or others who had a difficult time on orbit with relations with mission control, for example, or problems at home.
Many of these problems would seem minor if they weren't magnified by the effects of isolation and the stress it applies to different regions of the brain.
You know, in isolation and confinement, one of the things that happens is trivial issues are exaggerated. Little things are blown out of proportion.
And yet, Stuster says astronauts and other expeditioners don't end up permanently damaged. He says he's been amazed time and time again how well astronauts adapt to space and then back to life at home.
Every one of them who I have met has been exceptional in important ways. And one of those ways is that they're resilient.
It's important to recognize that resilience is
Resilience.
astronauts are pre-selected for, and they still have to work hard at it. One of the astronauts Stuster has studied is Mike Fink, one of NASA's most veteran space flyers, flying on 3 missions for a total of 381 days in orbit.
As soon as we land, we want everything to be the way it was before, and that just doesn't work.
Most of the astronaut reintegration process is designed to address the pain of returning from low Earth orbit.
We meet with a physical trainer, and they work us out the heck out of us so that our muscles and bones come back.
But NASA
That's
also
so
has a
key.
family support
Physical.
to help astronauts anticipate some of the interpersonal
Emotional.
and emotional challenges of returning. Because after a long time away, even minor changes can be jarring.
For example, my wife was in charge, and then I came back, and I didn't immediately say, no, I'm in charge now. No, that wasn't going to work. I'd be really tired at the end of the day, and my wife said, hey, time to take out the trash. It's like, well, I guess I'm back.
Getting back to a normal routine is important for reuniting with family and friends. It also has lots of important health implications. Recent studies suggest the hippocampus is surprisingly resilient, given sufficient exercise combined with a diet rich in antioxidants. Sleep is also incredibly helpful,
Mm-hmm.
particularly REM sleep, when researchers believe the hippocampus is forming memories. Meanwhile, researchers like Muriel Zelikowski are exploring possible drug treatments that could protect the brain from isolation-induced damage. Their interventions have shown promising results in mice, but they're still a long way from having something they could bring to humans. which leaves most experts recommending, at least for now, that people in isolation try to frame it as an opportunity and grow from experiencing a new perspective.
It reduces your social relationships totally to the core of communicating, of getting to know each other, taking care of each other, and trying to have the best possible time together. And I think that is totally valuable.
That's pretty good. Okay. So some more of this article. University of California, Los Angeles undergrad student Genesis Gutierrez discovered he's actually preferred his pandemic lifestyle, especially the money he's been saving by attending college virtually. I'm sure some of you university students would have something to say. Either it'd be interesting to see if you agreed or not. It'd be interesting to see what you thought about this idea in general. And obviously, I'm going to be asking about something related to that at some point. But this guy's saying post-pandemic life means I would have to move to LA again and pay for a ridiculously expensive apartment to go to classes I've been able to go to in my own home. He says, I've been able to work from home, do stuff outside of academics, and learn more about myself. Advances of in technology, Theo says, have put people at risk of developing this concept called hikikomori or hikikomori. I had practiced it and had it good, and then I kind of forgot. I think it's hikikomori. But it's this idea that means like this acute is a keyword, acute social withdrawal. Like it says, I read an article about it because that word was new to me, and it's a Japanese term that's used to describe both specifically people that are living kind of like hermits, what we would say in English, and also the act of living like a hermit. So it's like it's a noun and a verb, I guess. The $10,000 question is whether the prevalence of this type of extreme condition is increasing as a result of COVID. It's like a $1 question, of course it is. Teo says that particularly in young people or adolescents where the risk is greater because the stage is often when this extreme social withdrawal has been identified. And also, a lot of you are at that stage in life where, like, normally that's very social. So what can be done if someone's afraid to go out? Do people suffering from cave syndrome need professional treatment or just a bit more adjustment time? Northwestern University's Golan says it all depends on the level of severity. If a person has symptoms of exhaustion, depression, or anxiety, she advises measures that provide a sense of purpose in life, meditation, faith work, prayer, playing, or listening to music. Right, all these like really core grounding activities. Treatment for more extreme levels of anxiety require effective psychotherapy with a mental health professional who can offer cognitive therapies or other treatments that gradually expose a person to stressful situations and resolve their fears. Medication may also be used at times. Teo says that there's a type of disordered thinking that maybe things will be better later based on what we understand about immunity and variants to come aboard. The opposite is true, he adds. Distorted thinking. There's a type of distorted things that maybe things will be better later. Based on what we understand about immunity and the variants coming aboard, quite the opposite is true. That's certainly a pessimist. Is that the final sentence? So anyways, I thought this was a good article, but just ends. What are you doing, Scientific American? That didn't sound like it ended very good. But we'll find our way out of this. That's maybe a good place to end. Cheers.